Hi guys, this is Sai Kumar Kortiwada. In this video, we will learn about unit testing of validating a form group using a form controls. Here, let me quickly jump into Visual Studio Code. Here I have created a form group like login form group, and that has been injected into my HTML via a form group directive. And here we have username and a password. That are the form controls. That form controls are injected into my form input fields via form control name directive. So now what I want to test is I want to test these required validations over this form control via form group. So let me quickly go into the demo part, and if you see here the login button is disabled. When I click here, come outside, username is required, click here, come outside, use password is required. I can enter some value like sai@gmail.com. We have only required validation there. And coming to the password 1234567 8. So now the button is enabled. If I remove any one of the data from these particular fields, then my login button is disabled. That means whenever the field is invalid, then that should not have this login button. I have pasted again, and if I remove this from the field, then your login button is disabled. Let me go back here, the same thing. Now the login button is enabled. This feature we will be testing using a reactive form module in our unit testing. Now let me go to the spec file. Here what I want to do is I want to create a variable called as fixture, and that is of type component fixture, which is of app component. And now I created the component fixture. Let me create component instance via let component instance colon with type of component is app component. Now after the compilation is done, then fixture is equal to testbed dot create component of app component. Let me give app component, and then let me create an instance for this. Component instance is equal to fixture dot component instance. So I am giving a component instance fixture to the component instance variable. Let me save this, and I am using a module called as a reactive form module. So let me inject that reactive form modules into my imports array. Now let me create a it statement. Inside this it, what we will do is we will write the first scenario. The first scenario is we have to give a value to our username and the password, then it will be valid. I want to go only with the negative scenarios where either the username or the password is empty, then this login button should be disabled. So let's check that. So for example, it statement username or password is in required state, comma, callback function. Inside the callback function, let me update my fixture dot detect changes, and once the fixture is stable, then I want to do our external operation. Like let me get that input fields first. So by default our input field is not having any value in the form control because the form control name username does not have any value. It is having an empty field. So now let me give an ID for this. ID is equal to username, and also let me pass an ID is equal to password. So by using detect changes, my login form group controls has been injected here. I want to get this username and the password into my spec file first. So let me get that const username element, which is of type input HTML input element. Let me go here, HTML input element is equal to, I want to get by using fixture dot debug element dot fixture dot debug element dot native element dot query selector of my ID. So let me pass the ID. The ID is indicated with hash, and let me pass username. I got the username field. Now I want to do username element dot value is equal to some value like Sai Kumar. And now what I want to do is I want to update our user element by using a dispatch event. Username element dot dispatch event of new event. What is my event I'm doing here? That is an input event. Now my input event has been dispatched, so this value has been updated to my TS form control username. And in the same way, here we are not giving any password value, but what I want to do is I want to use password element colon HTML input element with a fixture dot debug element dot native element dot query selector of I wanna give a password here. But this time the password element I want to give is a valid field. So let me give 12345 6 as my password, and let me dispatch an event over this element. New event of input. In this case, both are valid scenarios. So let me update this password field and user field by using a fixture dot detect changes. Let me detect the changes, and once the fixture is again stable, I want to have a callback called as promise, and inside the callback, let me check the button disability. So here, let me use id is equal to button. So let me go to spec file, get the button element, btn element, and here I want to pass HTML input element is equal to fixture dot debug element dot native element dot query selector of what is my button, which is a hash, and already we gave the button as a button id. And now what I want to do is I want to check this button id element is disabled or not. So in this case both values has been entered, so the button element should not have a disable property. So button element dot disable, this is something like not the input element, we are giving HTML button element, and we can check disable property over this. Disabled is to be falsy because that is not disabled. And also we can expect something like a form group value. So component instance dot form group dot get of username, I can get the username value dot value, and to be equal to equal of what is my equality value. The username value should be equivalent to my Sai Kumar value. So let me give here, and also in the same way let me copy this expectation, but for this statement we will be checking a password value, and the password value should be equal to 12345 6, and also expect a form group validity. That means login form group dot valid dot to be truthy, because it will return a true or false statement, and in this case all the elements inside my particular form is valid. Hence let me save this HTML, save this spec file. Now you can see the application running here. Whatever the expectations we are giving here, they have been executed successfully. Now all the test cases has been passed for a valid scenario. And now what I want to do is I want to check with invalid scenario. So for invalid scenario, what we can do is instead of writing whole code, let me copy this, paste here, but let me change the description. It username and the password is not in required state, not in required state, because we gave some values. Now what I want to do is either of the one, let me remove the password. Okay, and then let me check the password value here. Now the validity will be falsy, to be falsy. Why? Because I have a invalid password element, and also the disable functionality will be to be truthy. Why? Because whenever any of the form control is invalid, then my disable functionality will be enabled. Let me save this, and now here we give Sai Kumar and then empty. In this case the required state username or password is in required state. That means in this case only the password is in required state. Let me remove this username and save this, and if you see here both has been successfully passed. And also let me go with the one more scenario where the username is required. That means let me copy the same statements and pass the username is invalid, username is in required state. So in this case I want to remove this Sai Kumar and give the password 12345 6, and then I can get the password as 12345 6, and I should not get any value in the username, and it should be equivalent to empty, whereas my form will be invalid and also the button will be in disabled state. Let me save this. If you see here, we have three successful cases, and the last case is something related to my submit button. So whenever we have a type submit, the ng submit will be triggered, and this should call a login, and that login method is something here. So before calling a function, we have to create a spy function. Before that, let me create a statement. This is a new statement where check whether ng submit is called or invoked. So this is having a callback function. Inside this callback function, let me write fixture dot detect changes, and then let me write fixture dot when stable whenever it is stable, and give the value for dot then. And in this case, let me check whether that particular ng submit is invoked or not. Before that, let me create a mock function. Mock function can be created by using a spyon function, which is having a component instance as a first parameter, and the second parameter is a method name called as login, and there should be something like call through. So whenever I call this, it has to call this login function and it should invoke. So now what I want to do is I created a mock function, and let me get the button. Const button element colon html button element is equal to fixture dot debug element dot native element dot query selector of what is my selector, it is hash button. And now I got the button to my button element, and whenever I click this particular button, then my spy function should be called. So let me click that button element dot click event over that button element. Then my expectation is expect of mock function should be called one time. So let me use a mock function thought to have been called times of 1. That means whenever I click this button, this login mock function should be called at least one time. That means to have been called one time. Let me save this, and if you see the output here, it is not giving any output. Why? Because if you see, we are calling this button, but the button will be in disabled state. When it will be enabled, whenever we are giving a proper values to our component instance form group values. So in this case, what I can do is just copy these elements and then paste here, which is having a valid data. So let me show the valid data here, Sai Kumar. So now my input field username will have some value, and also password will be having some value. Now let me detect the changes. Fixture dot detect changes, and fixture dot when stable, whenever this is stable, then I'll have a callback function. Inside the callback function, let me use this button so that the button will be not in disabled state. So first check before clicking this, what we have to do, we have to check a button element should not be disabled. Dot disabled dot to be falsy, because whenever it is falsy, then only my click event will work over that button element. So in this case, if this fails, no need to execute this particular click event. Let me save this and scroll down. Here if you see, 4 has been successfully passed. Previously, why it was not working? Because the problem is button is in disabled state. Whenever the button is in disabled state, we cannot click that button, and this mock function will never be called. So that is the reason it is showing 0 for that. And this is how we can test our form fields and form group with a form controls with a required validations. If you have more number of validations, we can validate via passing these values as invalid states, and then we can check whether that form is getting updated or not. And also we missed a few things to find. That means whenever this is in a valid state, that means a password is not password and the username is in not in a required state, then this both divs will never be rendered. So we can check that by using id is equal to username error. So I'm giving a id for this as username errors, whereas let me copy this and paste here where we will be getting a password errors. So let me go to the first statement. In this first statement, after updating with a valid data, I'll not get that error. So let me get that elements first. So user error elements colon html div element. So is equal to, this will be equal to fixture dot debug element dot native element dot query selector of my username elements. That means errors, username errors. Copy this and pass here. This will not be existing, and let me copy the same thing, paste here. Now let me give a password errors, and let me pass the id as password errors. Let me copy this password errors, pass here. And now in this case both will not be having a value. That means expect of user errors elements dot to be null. That means it should not be existing. And also the same scenario for your password as well. So this will be equal to your password elements. Let me copy this, paste here, save this. Now whenever we are giving a valid data, that is what expected, and it has been successfully passed. Let me copy the same stuff and go to the second scenario. Let me minimize this, and if you go to the second scenario, it password is in required state. That means we are not passing the password. So let's check that this should be null, whereas password should not be null. So we can check like not to be null. And the same case for the username, where username is in required state. After updating the UI, then we can check this should not be null, not to be null, and this should be equal to null. Why? Because it has been fulfilled the required validations. And let me save this, and here ng submit. Already in the ng submit we have the click event for the button itself, so no need to check anything. So this is how we can check our validations over a form control inside a form group using reactive forms and its modules. Hope you like my explanation. If you like my video, like, share, subscribe to my channel for more updates. Signing off. Thank you.